If you have a Bible and you like following along with the reading, please turn in it to Matthew chapter 12. This is where we'll spend our time. This particular way of thinking is one of those things that occurs to me sometimes when I'm driving, things like that. A lot of things occur to me while I'm driving. And my failure is to not spend the energy and the time to write it down when it occurs to me, which happens a lot. But what you see in God is a specific type of love. Now, the Bible calls it agape, and we could go into a description of all that, but I want to look at it in terms of its attributes as compared to a different kind of love. The attributes of God's love is that it's self-sacrificing, always, relentlessly forgiving, unconditional in terms of the fact that he loves all of humanity, and he doesn't look at us in terms of our behavior necessarily in terms of whether or not he loves us. He loves us whether we're behaving properly or not, or even if we don't know him, or even if we claim to hate him, he still loves us. You see that on the cross when Jesus asks God to forgive all of them who are nailing him up there and they don't know what they're doing. But there's a love that's different than that. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago, but this is a different aspect of it. I'm going to say more foundational. And that is the kind of love, believe it or not, that Satan offers people. Now, I have to qualify the term love there, but let's just leave it alone for now. It's a perversion of the love that God offers, a complete perversion. How do I say that? Well, first thing is it's completely self-centered. That's a perversion of God's love, which is completely selfless. It's completely indulgent. That is, the love is all about what's good for me. It's conditional. If you don't believe that, I would suggest you do some reading into people who have been part of being Satanists in some way or another and following Satan and finding out at some point, which I think is a blessing to them, that all of a sudden they realize this isn't what I thought. And I've been cast aside by this being. And it's completely unforgiving. If you are a follower of Satan and you mess up, you're tossed aside just like a piece of torn clothing. So with that in mind, let's think about this in some way as to describe it. Let's look at the scripture that I'm going to use today, which is Matthew chapter 12. Matthew chapter 12. And see what that would help us in the way of thinking through this issue. Chapter 12, verse 1, at that time Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry, and they started to pick the grains of wheat and eat them. But when the disciples saw this, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is against the law to do on the Sabbath day." Jesus said, "Well, haven't you read what David and his disciples did? They were hungry. They entered the house of God, and they ate the sacred bread, which was only for the priests to eat and was against the law for David and his companions to eat. Or have you not read in the law that the priests in the temple desecrate the Sabbath every Sabbath, and yet they're not found guilty? I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. If you had known what this means, I want mercy and not sacrifice, you would have not condemned the innocent. For the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath." Then Jesus left that place and entered their synagogue, and a man was there who had a withered hand. And they asked Jesus, these same Jewish Pharisees, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" So that they could accuse Jesus. Jesus said to them, "Would not any one of you, if you had a sheep that fell into a pit on the Sabbath day, take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a person than a sheep? So is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath?" Then he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." The man stretched his hand out, and it was restored as healthy as the other hand. But the Pharisees went out and plotted against Jesus as to how they could assassinate him. Now, look at the way Jesus handles the law here. I love this because there's a lot here that if you don't know the history of the oral law, which is difficult to dig up, you have to dig extra biblical Jewish sources to even discover what's in there, or if you have good commentaries, you may see this. What were they doing that broke the law? What they were doing was they were threshing on the Sabbath. You see, they would pick the heads. You can't just eat the head. It's got a husk on it. So you have to rub it between your hands to separate the husk from the kernel so that you can eat the wheat kernels. That's what they were doing. They were literally threshing the wheat between the palms of their hands. That's not proper to do on the Sabbath. Jesus, you notice here, says a sheep falls in a hole, and who of you wouldn't take the time and trouble to lift the sheep out? You know why he said that? Because in the oral law, work was lifting anything heavier than a dried fig. Well, a sheep weighs a lot more than a dried fig. So he's just confronting them with what they're really saying. And what they're saying is they have a system of perversion of the law that they now have adopted as the version of the law. That is the oral law that goes way beyond the 613 precepts of Moses. And these perversions, as they were then inflicted on the common people. Now you just stop and think. Let's stop and dream for just a minute. If you can't lift anything heavier than a dried fig, how will you lift a baby who needs your attention on the Sabbath day? You can't. So nobody could live this out. The Pharisees could live it out. You know why? Because the Pharisees were being supported by temple tax, and they didn't have to do anything if they didn't want to. They could take Sunday, or Saturday in this case, the Sabbath, and do absolutely nothing because they didn't have any responsibilities. And any responsibilities they did have were carried out by those who they called the people of the land. There are still people in Orthodoxy who do this today, Orthodox Jewish homes. They will hire a Gentile to come and do things like turn light switches on and off. There are always ways around this stuff, right? You take the Hindus who are known as the Jains. The Jains believe you cannot kill anything, including a plant. Now stop and think for a moment. How are you going to eat anything? They wear a mask when they walk around so that they don't even ingest an insect by accident. How do they get around that? Well, they go with a begging bowl to somebody's house where that person has already cooked the vegetables and killed them, and then they eat them. I'm not responsible for the dead vegetables. You are, but I'm going to eat them so that I can live. So there's always these ways around this stuff that people contrive. But these things are weights that were inflicted on all the common people by the Pharisees at the time. This is why Jesus was so hard on them. That's why he was so hard on the Pharisees. Take, for instance, the prodigal. The prodigal ran away. This is, I think, a very clear indication of the difficulty with the law that the common person had. Who was the father in the prodigal story is the law. The father's law. He's the law. The prodigal looks at the father's law and says, this is not fun. I don't like the restrictions that the law places on me. I don't want to live in your household under the law anymore. And so I'm going to leave. Did you know what the Bible, the Greek translators call the prodigal? We have a term in theology known as soteriology that comes from sotos, which is salvation. And the prodigal is called asotos, not saved. They put the not prefix in front of sotos. So you've got this constant responsibility that the prodigal feels. He runs away from the weights to a different country and does what? He perverts the law that he does know. How does he do that? By all of the disparate living that he engages in. Some people, I bet you when Jesus told this story, I'm going to bet and say some people were out there listening and they thought, maybe the prodigal will find a new world here and become a responsible adult citizen. I bet you they thought that as Jesus was telling it. They didn't know where the story was going to go. But his distance there is perhaps he'll become his own man and seize the opportunity to be responsible and a good adult. But that's, of course, not what happened. Two things emerge from the distance. One is he's outside the Father's gaze, so the law no longer constrains him because the Father can't see him anymore, right? He's in a distant country. And then the prodigal's loves all become perverted toward satanic loves, in that he disposes of all of his income with prostitutes and loose living. The prodigal is just like the Pharisees. And here's the connection I'd like to try to make. The Pharisees were angry people. Why were they angry? Two reasons. One, they all of this oral law constrained them. They were angry about that, even if they couldn't get in touch with it within themselves. But they have a different anger. They're angry at those who won't obey it like they do. They're angry at them, the people of the land. And so they're angry at Jesus because Jesus seems to agree with the people of the land. You know, anger is an incredible thing. It's a good thing. It's part of who we are. Anger is proper in some instances, but it can also become a weapon where it's destructive in ways that God never intended anger to be destructive. I think about people today. It's a remarkable time. Who would have thought that we'd come to a place where somebody could get angry at somebody sufficiently that they could go on the World Wide Web and destroy their life with just a comment? And yet that's where we live. The Bible says that anger destroys wisdom. The one who is slow to anger is great in understanding, Solomon says, but the one who has a quick temper exalts folly. Think about it yourself. I think about myself. Maybe I'm the only one, who's been in such a heated passion that you get that white stuff in the corner of your mouth and you're shouting loudly and you're not making a lot of sense. And what do we sound like when we get like that? An idiot, right? Well, it's because we are an idiot in that moment. That's why we sound like one. We're just, anger strips away any sensibility about anything that we would call wisdom completely and makes us an idiot. But you can't love somebody without proper anger. Think about anybody you have ever loved. What would it do to you to see someone hurting them? It'd make me angry. That's a proper anger. Hate, we think, is the opposite of love. That's only partially true. There's a deeper hate. The deepest hate is indifference. Complete indifference. Think about what we call a psychopath. A psychopath feels nothing of any empathy toward another human being. Think about what Mao did in the Cultural Revolution and in the Great Leap Forward. Starving people to death, torturing people who disagreed. Still goes on today. And yet there's no sense of pain, no sense of empathy with these people who are being hurt in this way. That makes me angry. That makes me angry because that kind of hatred is the deepest hatred possible. Complete indifference to anybody's suffering. Complete indifference to it. Anger is love in motion when it's directed at the person who is harming someone we love. That's all it is. We love them, and it makes us angry to see someone hurt them. The question for anger is, what am I defending? And in the case of the loved, it's the beloved. I mean, what would you think of somebody who could stand back and passively watch someone be deeply hurt? For me, that's like in movies. Who is the coldest, most hated person in the movie? It's the person who dispassionately watches people being hurt. So here we've got all of this. Now, there are perversions of love and anger that we suffer from. Here's one. Has anybody ever said this to you, or have you ever said this to anybody? You get into a conflict and you say to somebody, well, I'm not angry at you, I'm just hurt. You ever heard that? What are you saying? You're saying, I'm better than you are because I'm not mad. That's what's being said. And this gets said in churches. I mean, it's almost like there's some shame in being angered by something. You ever been like this? Think about this. You've got to be somewhere and you've got so much time to get there. You leave the house, you're driving. Let's just say you're driving. And you get on the road and you're angry. I'm angry that the person in front of me won't go faster. Well, maybe I should have just left earlier. That would have solved that whole problem, right? We're angry. Here's the bottom line. When we look at this thing, here's where I see the perversion of love. We are angrier at the person who disses us in some way or holds us up or causes us inconvenience. We're angrier at that than we are angry that people are being tortured to death in North Korea. What's wrong with us? I mean, we are so messed up. It's just incredible to me. Well, the Pharisees were like this. They had a rebellion in their heart. They did not like living under the laws they lived under. There are 7 different kinds of Pharisees, all of these intricate ways. And one Pharisaic group looked at another and said, you're not doing it right. This Pharisaic group, say the one that wore the fez that covered their eyes so they couldn't see sin, is looking at the ones who don't wear the fez and say, you're not doing it right. It's like they rebel against what Jesus confronts them with here. I don't desire sacrifice nearly as much as I desire mercy. And it's like the Pharisees had become what I would call a branch on a tree that decides it wants to saw itself off from the tree. It's no longer hooked to God any longer. And so what does the limb that falls on the ground next to the tree trunk do? When it hits the ground, it starves to death because there's no way for it to be fed. The Pharisees had starved themselves to where there was no love left in them whatsoever toward the people of the land, the very people that God had given them, so they thought, charge to lead. They were angry at anybody who would not accept the burdens that they had heaped upon themselves. G.K. Chesterton says a lot about this in his book, Orthodoxy, where he talks about the modern revolutionary who really doesn't know any longer what to rebel against, and so isn't fit for any kind of rebellion at all. What reins us in, however, is when we start to define love the way God defines it. He defines it this way in Romans. He says, love does no harm to its neighbor, therefore love fulfills the entirety of the law. Loving ourselves as we, and you know that's not a New Testament term. Did you know that? That comes from Leviticus 19. That's where Paul gets it. It's a quotation. The Pharisees, here they are, doing everything possible to be completely scrupulous in their way of living before God, but they completely forgot the essence of it all, which was love does no harm to its neighbor. We have this advantage, don't we? We're made in God's image. We've got all of the advantages, and yet we don't seem to exercise them so often. We're self-aware. We're able to imagine things that don't even exist. We can think abstractly. We're able to convey our thoughts one to another via language. We're self-directing. We can decide things and think creatively and create things from the raw materials we have. And this one is the most amazing to me. We remember. Think about what memory means, that you and I have the capacity to bridge time and space with just a memory. I can remember something when I was a child, and I can bridge those 60 years in an instant. That's a miracle to me. That's a miracle. And one of our problems today is that these things about who we are as human beings do not seem so miraculous any longer to us. We just accept them for what they are. And if you erase the miracle of what it is to be human, then all manner of butchery becomes available to anybody who does that. The Nazi doctors were a case in point. They had no empathy whatsoever for the children that they experimented upon as they did so. The Pharisees did not see the miracle of life in the people of the land at all. They didn't see it. The people of the land were just there to be lorded over, not loved. But Jesus loved them. He loved the people of the land. That's why in this text, the Pharisees wanted more to see Jesus killed than they could celebrate the fact that the man with the withered hand now had his hand restored. Think of the mindset there. So what does perversion produce? If we pervert love, what happens to us? Well, I'll tell you. Let me give you a modern scenario here, and you see what you think about this. This is actually happening right now. Right now. It produces a culture wherein public officials are more concerned about the media's response to their critique of a 50-year-old man who identifies as a 13-year-old girl and goes into 13-year-old girl swimming contests, changes clothes in the locker rooms with the 13-year-old girls because he identifies as a 13-year-old girl. And then it produces parents who will stand by and endorse that by allowing their little girls to stay in that swimming contest. That's what perversion of love does. That's satanic love. This man loves himself so much that he's willing to inflict this on little girls. And the public officials love themselves so much that they're not willing to take the media heat to say this is wrong. It's happening right now in Canada. You can read about it yourself. Just like the Pharisees who would say, we hate Jesus' disobedience as we see it to be of the law so much that we're willing to see him killed more than we want to see a man's hand restored to him. That's incredible to me. G.K. Chesterton said this. He said, anybody who will not permit a softening of their heart will ultimately find a softening of their brain. I think he's exactly right. The worst thing that any human being can hear from God is this, when God looks at us and says, your will be done. I'll tell you what I want, and I'm going to read it. In Revelation chapter 21, you can follow if you like. I use this at every funeral I do because it means so much to me. This is what I want to see. I don't want to see any more 50-year-old guys stripping naked in front of 13-year-old girls while they strip naked in a locker room and thinking that's all right. What I want to see is this. I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had ceased to be, and the sea existed no more. And then I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, descending from heaven, from God, ready like a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, look, God is going to live among human beings. He'll live among them and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them. He'll wipe away every tear. Death will not exist anymore. No mourning, no crying, no pain, for all the former things will be done away with. And the one seated on the throne said, look, I'm making everything new. Then he said to me, write it down, because these words are reliable and true. He also said to me, it is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the one who's thirsty, I'll give water free of charge from the spring of the water of life. And the one who conquers will inherit these things. I will be their God, and they will be my children. That's what I want to see. And I don't think there's a remedy for any of this stuff until that happens. I really don't. But thank God, that he's given us this remedy. No matter how bad it gets here, with the perversion of love that we see all around us, God offers this eternity to us when we'll see everything set right. I don't know how anybody can think of justice except that it be a mockery without God setting everything right. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I've said anything